June 30th, 1908. The world was asleep, not metaphorically but literally, as dawn broke across the vast, silent expanse of central Siberia. In a remote, roadless region along the Podkamina Tunguska River, a reindeer herder named Vasily of the indigenous Evenki people was already awake, tending to his small, precious flock. The air was bitingly cold, as it often was even in summer, but it was clean and carried the scent of wet pine and damp earth. The taiga stretched for thousands of miles in every direction, a timeless, undulating sea of green and brown, broken only by meandering rivers and marshy bogs. For Vasily, this was not a wilderness to be conquered, but a world to be known. Every creak of a tree, every shift in the wind was a syllable in a language his people had spoken for centuries. His life was a rhythm of seasons and herds, a rhythm undisturbed by the distant clamor of the 20th century, the age of automobiles, airplanes, and wireless telegraphy. Tsar Nicholas II ruled from St. Petersburg, over 3,500 miles to the west, but here his authority was a phantom, a distant rumor less real than the tracks of a sable in the snow. The stakes here were primal: survival against the cold, the finding of pasture, the continuity of a way of life. This morning, as a thin mist clung to the hollows and the first true light of day began to bleach the velvet of the night sky, Vasily looked up. He saw the constellations he knew, the Great Bear, the Pole Star, begin to fade. It was a moment of profound, ancient peace. He took a deep breath of the frigid air, unaware that he was inhaling the last seconds of the old world. In the heavens above him, an object was falling. It had traveled for possibly millions of years across unimaginable distances, and its journey was about to end not with a whisper, but with a scream that would rip the sky in two and echo through the corridors of history, science, and conspiracy for over a century. While Vasily stood in the Tunguska wilderness, the rest of humanity was looking the other way. The world's scientific and military infrastructure, what little global monitoring existed in 1908, was fatally complacent. Astronomy was an ancient science, but the idea of systematically watching the skies for existential threats was a fantasy. Telescopes were trained on the static dance of planets and the slow drift of comets, not on hunting for invisible, fast-moving chunks of interplanetary debris. The flaw was not in a machine, but in a mindset, a profound, species-wide failure of imagination. The universe, to the learned men in their European observatories, was a clockwork mechanism of majestic, predictable order. Cataclysms from space were the stuff of sensational novels by H.G. Wells, not serious academic journals. This intellectual arrogance was matched by a geopolitical blindness. Siberia was a void on the map, a place of exile and forgetting. To the Russian imperial authorities, it was a resource to be extracted and a frontier to be pacified, not a place where world history could be made in an instant. There were no watchful eyes here, no weather stations equipped with seismographs, no early networks of communication. Crucially, in the days and hours leading up to the event, there were sightings, glimpses of the flaw as it hurtled toward its rendezvous. Sailors on the Archer in the North Atlantic reported strange phosphorescent clouds and a peculiar silvery night sky. In towns across Siberia, people noted an odd, directionless glow after sunset, as if the horizon itself was luminous. But these reports were isolated, anecdotal, and disconnected. There was no system to connect them, no centralized authority to sound an alarm. They were curiosities, not clues. The greed here was not for money, but for cognitive comfort. It was easier to dismiss, to rationalize, to file away the anomalous. The system, scientific, governmental, human, was operating on the deep-seated, unexamined assumption that the cosmos was benign, or at least indifferent in a quiet way. It was a failure of vigilance born of peace. The Earth, in its annual journey around the sun, was plowing through the same space it had for eons.
The possibility that on this particular morning, at this particular longitude and latitude, that space would not be empty was a statistical ghost no one heeded. As Vasily watched his reindeer, as farmers in Ukraine began their morning chores, as train conductors in Trans-Siberia stations checked their pocket watches, the object entered the atmosphere. It was moving at over 33,000 miles per hour. It was not made of solid iron like most meteorites that survive impact. Its composition, a critical and tragic flaw in its own structure, would be the key to the devastation and the mystery. It was a loosely aggregated pile of ice, rock, and dust, a small comet or a stony asteroid. It was fragile, and it was heading for the one spot on the globe where its arrival could be both maximally destructive and maximally obscure.
For Vasily, it began not with sight, but with sound, a low subterranean rumble, not from the earth, but from the air itself, a pressure wave so deep it vibrated in his sternum before it reached his ears. He froze, his hand on a reindeer's flank. The animals lifted their heads, nostrils flaring. The rumble sharpened, escalated into a tearing, ripping shriek, as if the fabric of the sky was being shredded from horizon to horizon. He looked up. The northwestern sky was no longer blue. A colossal, incandescent column was streaking across it, blindingly blue-white, trailing a vast, churning plume of smoke and fire. It was not a point of light, but a thing with apparent width, a flying mountain of flame. The sound was now a continuous, deafening roar, 1,000 locomotives screaming in unison. He could feel the heat on his face, a dry, searing wind that smelled of ozone and cinders. The light became unbearable, casting stark, racing shadows that made the forest seem to dance in a strobe of hellfire. He threw himself to the ground, burying his face in the lichen as the world became pure, violent sensation. 60 miles to the northwest, at the Vanawara trading post, shopkeeper Semyon Semyonov was sitting on his porch steps. He saw the northern sky split open. "It appeared as though my shirt was on fire," he would later recount, his words trembling even decades later. The radiant heat was so intense he felt his skin blistering. He saw a flash so powerful it seemed to consume the world, and in a reflexive, self-preserving act he tore his eyes away, stumbling backwards into his house. He was saved from blindness by that instinctive flinch. As he cowered inside, the sound arrived, a series of colossal percussive thuds that were not heard so much as felt in the bones, followed by a rolling, thunderous boom that went on, shaking the log house so violently that soot rained from the chimney and china crashed from shelves. At the epicenter, the universe ended. The object, stressed beyond its limits by atmospheric pressure, did not strike the ground. It detonated in a mid-air thermal blast, approximately 5 miles above the forest. In a microsecond, it released energy equivalent to 10 to 15 million tons of TNT, over 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The fireball alone was hotter than the surface of the sun. A supersonic shockwave of pure force radiated outward in a perfect expanding circle of annihilation. The forest directly below ceased to exist. Millions of ancient larch and pine trees were instantly carbonized, reduced to standing, smoldering statues of charcoal. Just beyond this zone of vaporization, the shockwave hit like the fist of God. Trees were not merely knocked down, they were plucked from the earth, hurled like matchsticks, and laid out in a breathtaking, terrifying radial pattern, a perfect, shattered sunflower of destruction spanning over 800 square miles. The ground shook with the violence of a magnitude 5.0 earthquake, registering on seismographs as far away as England. The atmospheric shockwave circumnavigated the globe twice, recorded by barographs worldwide. In the immediate aftermath, a colossal, roiling pillar of dust and smoke ascended over 12 miles into the stratosphere, glowing with an unearthly light.
For hundreds of miles around, the sky did impossible things. Nights turned luminescent. In London, weeks later, people could read newspapers outdoors at midnight by the strange diffused glow from suspended particulate matter. The dust filtered the sun, creating spectacular blood-red sunsets across Europe for months. But in central Siberia, the immediate aftermath was a cacophony of terror. Herds of reindeer were incinerated where they stood. Hunters were thrown from their feet, their cabins collapsing around them. The air was filled with a suffocating, burning smell and the constant, eerie crash of falling broken trees. A hot, gritty wind, the dying breath of the explosions, scoured the landscape. Vasily, miles from ground zero but still horrifically close, was lifted and thrown against a tree trunk, the wind knocked from him. He came to in a world transformed. The familiar contours of his hills were gone. The sky was a sickly yellowish gray, and a steady black rain, a precipitation of soot, ash, and vaporized rock, began to fall, coating everything in a filthy, toxic sludge. The silence that followed the roar was the most profound sound he had ever heard, a ringing, heavy void, broken only by the moan of the wind through a million shattered trees and the distant, panicked cries of his few surviving animals. It was not the silence of peace, but of death, of a world holding its breath.
For days, there was no rescue, because there was no concept that anything had happened requiring it. The Tunguska Basin, already isolated, was now sealed off by a cordon of downed timber, a labyrinth of splintered wood piled 3 stories high in places, and obscured by strange, persistent fogs. The few survivors, like Vasily and Semyon, were in a state of profound shock, their worldview shattered as completely as the forest. They spoke of an angry god, Ogdi, who had come to destroy the world. They avoided the direction of the blast, fearing the poisoned ground and the spirits of the dead. It would be over a decade before the outside world, preoccupied with war and revolution, would turn its gaze to this scar on the map. The first real rescue was, in fact, an investigation. In 1921, Leonid Kulik, a driven mineralogist from the Soviet Academy of Sciences, became obsessed with scant reports of a giant meteorite fall in Siberia. He saw not a disaster, but a scientific treasure trove, a chance to salvage thousands of tons of precious meteoric iron for the young Soviet state. His was a mission fueled not by compassion, but by a mix of scientific curiosity and resource greed. In 1927, after years of struggle for funding, he mounted the first expedition. What he found stripped away all his preconceptions. After an arduous journey by rail, boat, and finally on foot, hacking through the still impenetrable deadfall, Kulik and his team crested a ridge. He expected a crater. He found a landscape from a nightmare. As far as his eye could see, to every horizon, the trees were flattened, all pointing radially away from a central point. At that center, not a pit, but a cluster of weird, waterlogged bogs, and a stand of skeletal, branchless trees, stripped and blackened, still standing like grim sentinels. There was no massive meteorite, no crater, no treasure. Kulik's fight for survival became intellectual and logistical. How do you explain this? He meticulously mapped the blast zone, interviewed the scattered Evenki witnesses who were deeply reluctant to speak of the event they considered sacred and cursed, and collected samples of the bizarre black rain residue. His survival tools were notebooks, cameras, and sheer, stubborn will. He faced a different kind of terror, the terror of the inexplicable. The psychological toll was immense. He had staked his reputation on a giant impact, and the evidence was refusing to cooperate. He led 3 more expeditions in the 1930s, draining the strange bogs with pumps, desperately searching for fragments that were not there. The taiga fought him at every step, swarms of mosquitoes, early snows, supply shortages. The local guides grew increasingly anxious, believing Kulik was provoking the angry spirits of the place. His final expedition in 1939 was cut short by war. Kulik, the man who dedicated his life to solving Tunguska, would die in 1942 as a prisoner of war, the mystery still gnawing at him. The true long-term survival effort was not of people, but of an explanation. In the decades that followed, as the world learned of nuclear weapons, Tunguska found a terrifying new context. The descriptions, the flash, the fireball, the shock wave, the radial forest blowdown, the lack of a crater, were uncannily familiar to physicists who had witnessed atomic tests. The mid-air burst hypothesis, first proposed in the 1930s, gained overwhelming credibility. The fight was now against a different kind of oblivion, the oblivion of unsolved history. Scientists became detectives on a 50-year-old crime scene, using new tools like computer modeling and radionuclide analysis of tree rings. They fought against wilder, more sensational theories that rushed to fill the vacuum of certainty. Each new expedition, from the 1950s through the 2000s, was a race against time, as the physical evidence, the scorched trees, the subtle chemical traces in the peat, slowly faded back into the ecosystem.
The investigation into Tunguska is the longest-running forensic examination of a crime in which the primary suspect is the cosmos itself. The official scientific verdict, supported by the overwhelming consensus of evidence, is that it was the airburst of a small asteroid or cometary fragment, approximately 60 to 80 meters in diameter. Its stony, porous structure caused it to explode with its entire kinetic energy converted into a blast wave rather than impacting and excavating a crater. This was the critical, unnoticed flaw in the object's design that led to its unique destructiveness. But the true aftermath of Tunguska is not just a solved puzzle. It is a paradigm shift in humanity's relationship with its environment. Tunguska was the first, loudest, and most recent warning shot across our planetary bow. It demonstrated with apocalyptic clarity that extinction-level events are not relics of the dinosaur age. They are a permanent feature of our cosmic neighborhood. The systemic failure it exposed was global, a total lack of preparedness for, or even awareness of, the threat from near-Earth objects, NEOs. The long-term changes born from this realization have been sweeping and permanent. Tunguska is the foundational case study for the field of planetary defense. It directly led to
the institutionalization of the search. Beginning in the 1990s, NASA and other space agencies, spurred by congressional mandates citing Tunguska as a key rationale, initiated formal, funded programs to catalog potentially hazardous objects, PHOs. Projects like Linear, Neowise, and the Catalina Sky Survey are the direct heirs to Kulik's lonely quest. The creation of a global early warning network. The International Asteroid Warning Network and Space Mission Planning Advisory Group under the UN were established to coordinate detection, threat assessment, and potential response plans across national boundaries. Tunguska proved the threat is global. The response must be too. The development of deflection strategies. Tunguska moved the question from "could it happen?" to "what would we do?" This spurred research into kinetic impactors like NASA's successful DART mission, gravity tractors, and other technologies to nudge a future threatening asteroid off course. We are no longer passive potential victims. The cultural consciousness. The event seeded a century of science fiction and popular anxiety about asteroids, from When Worlds Collide to Armageddon. This cultural awareness maintains public and political support for funding planetary defense programs. The survival hook of Tunguska is this: it forced us to look up. It ended our complacent assumption that space is empty and benign. The permanent change is a line item in national budgets, a network of telescopes scanning the skies every night, and a profound understanding that human history can be altered in an instant by a random piece of cosmic debris. We are the first generation to actively watch for the next one, to have a plan, however nascent. The lesson of Tunguska is not just about a rock that fell in Siberia. It's about the fragility of our civilization and the sobering responsibility that comes with the knowledge of our own potential end. The Tunguska forest has largely grown back, The scorched earth is green again, but in the twisted shapes of the few surviving telegraph pole trees and in the strange chemistry of the peat bogs, the memory of that morning is frozen in time. The event remains haunting because its simplest explanation, a random cosmic accident, is almost more unsettling than any conspiracy. It tells us that our greatest disasters may have no moral, no villain, no deeper meaning. They are simply the universe, indifferent and immense, reminding us of our place. We learn that the sky is not a ceiling, but a window, and sometimes things come through. We built systems to watch that window, but the chilling question remains, would we see the next one in time? Our next story also emerges from the depths of the 20th century, but its horrors are unmistakably, terrifyingly human. We travel from the vast, empty taiga to the manicured paths of a bustling urban park where a different kind of hunter was at work, one who used charm as a weapon and left a trail of red in the snow. Join us next time for the unidentified serial killer of Moscow's Gorky Park, the hunt for the Red Ripper.